I've recently recorded a description of what I call clinicians' illusions, thinking errors that clinicians make during their work. And one of them is confusing the symptoms that a person's having with knowing the root cause of those symptoms. And it's kind of a subtle error, but it's a cool one once you grasp it. For example, one of the very challenging forms of depression is called borderline personality disorder, and you can look it up on the internet if you want. But it comes on generally around adolescence, and it's a form of depression that's marked with extreme turbulence. The person goes from depression to panic and anxiety to anger and rage. There's a lot of thought of suicide, and quite a number of the patients, particularly if they get into drug abuse, end up committing suicide or making suicide attempts. As many as 10 or 15%. And they also mutilate themselves with razor blades and often have turbulent interactions with other people, including their therapists. And so their therapists are often very uncomfortable and in a state of a panic and anxiety in their attempt to be helpful to people with this disorder. And I would say that psychotherapy is improving and now becoming more powerful to be able to help people with borderline personality disorder. And in my clinical practice in Philadelphia, actually 29% of my patients had severe borderline personality disorder at the beginning of treatment. And a great many of them were helped by the cognitive therapy I was doing at that time. But at any rate, I heard recently that a new school of therapy, I think DBT, was making the claim I'm about to describe, and I could be off, but just from memory, that they had discovered that borderline personality disorder, the cause of it is they call emotional dysregulation in the brain, that there's a defect of emotional dysregulation. And the proof of that is that they go from one negative emotion to another. It's like an emotional roller coaster. And so when I heard that, I thought, wow, I didn't know we knew the cause of borderline personality disorder, but that sounds pretty compelling, and it fits. And I thought, gee, why? I'm glad I learned that, but must have been some really smart person who figured that out. But then I got to thinking about it, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I thought that insight is just kind of rubbish or ridiculous, because all you're doing is saying, if you look up borderline personality disorder in the DSM, you'll see that emotional lability, labile emotions, means that your emotions go up and down. That's one of the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. You can't be diagnosed with that unless you tend to be very emotional, going from one negative emotion to the next. And so when you say patients with borderline personality disorder have emotional dysregulation, well, that's just a description of the fact that their emotions are constantly going from one negative emotion to the next. It's not a cause, it's a symptom. So that's the thinking error, thinking that you've discovered a cause when all you've discovered is symptoms that were obvious from the very start. So I don't know if that's interesting for you. It might be too heady, too theoretical, too philosophical, but I find it kind of interesting to see the kind of thinking errors that clinicians make. And of course, the good news is now we have forms of therapy that offer real help and hope for individuals with the very painful and sad borderline personality disorder. The likelihood, the hope of changing those negative feelings and developing more loving relationships with others and a more joyous life, the chances for that is really very excellent now. The prognosis is good. So anyway, that's it on Clinician Solutions. I'm a clinician myself, and I've often made all kinds of errors in my life and in my career. And I kind of enjoy seeing how we clinicians can sometimes fool ourselves, because getting to the truth of what's going on with your patients can only lead to better therapy, better treatment, especially if the clinician is humble and open to seeing what's really going on and letting our patients teach us with the feedback they give us on scales that we use to assess changes in their feelings, scales to let them rate us on empathy, on helpfulness, so we can see when we're succeeding and when we're failing, and change strategies when it's not being helpful to our patients. So that's all for today, and thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.